Burkina Faso's transitional government has formally designated May 15th as the Journée de Coutumes et Traditions, Day of Customs and Traditions, a new annual public holiday created to recognize and protect indigenous spiritual practices long pushed to the margins. The measure was adopted at a Council of Ministers meeting chaired by Captain Ibrahim Traorè on March 6, 2024, and is now part of the country's official calendar. Officials say the day's purpose is twofold: to reaffirm the state's secularism and to restore space for traditional religion and ancestral rites in public life. By placing indigenous belief systems alongside Christianity and Islam in the civic rhythm of the nation, the decree aims to correct what authorities describe as a historic imbalance. Crucially, May 15th is declared a paid public holiday, a signal that the observance is meant to be lived, not merely symbolic. The Ministry of Territorial Administration underscored that recognition, noting that the date was chosen after consultations with ministries and traditional leaders. The move has quickly become a cultural touchstone inside and beyond Burkina Faso. Supporters argue it pushes back against centuries of narratives, rooted in colonial-era rule and missionary discourse, that labeled African spirituality as pagan or evil, and it reframes ancestral practices as a living pillar of identity and cohesion. In Ouagadougou, ministers have framed the holiday as a unifying civic ritual rather than a sectarian gesture, insisting that laicite is strengthened, not weakened, when indigenous beliefs are visible and dignified. Since its institution, the Day of Customs and Traditions has been marked with official messages and community activities, from libations and blessings led by custodians of the land to public dialogues on traditional jurisprudence, music, and dress. Government communiques around May 15, 2025 amplified the themes of social harmony and respect for custodians of heritage. Legal texts circulated by civil society repositories and government portals outline the decree's intent and organization. May 15th each year is set aside for the celebration of ancestral cults and values, with responsibilities for community-level organization resting with traditional practitioners in coordination with local authorities. Why this matters now? The new holiday dovetails with a broader state-led narrative under Traorè that leans into self-reliance, cultural sovereignty, and Pan-African symbolism. Analysts note that the government has leaned on culture, monuments, public rituals, and festival platforms to legitimize a political project that rejects foreign tutelage and seeks to rally a youthful population. This context helps explain why a calendrical reform can carry outsized political weight. Reactions and ripples. Public debate has been lively. Advocates hail a long-overdue rectification that puts indigenous custodians on equal civic footing and counters internalized stigma. Skeptics worry about adding another non-working day to an already crowded roster of holidays. Legal commentators, meanwhile, have parsed the decree's place in the hierarchy of norms and its intersection with existing religious holiday statutes. An early sign that the reform is stimulating not just ceremony but jurisprudence. Across the region and in the diaspora, the Burkina Faso example is being watched closely. Cultural organizations have framed the day as a template for destigmatizing African spirituality in public institutions, schools, media, and local governance, while preserving secular principles. Whether neighboring states follow suit remains an open question, but the symbolism has already traveled far beyond Burkina's borders. In a follow-up to the official decree that made May 15th the National Journée de Coutumes et Traditions, President Captain Ibrahim Traorè used his public message to frame the holiday as more than ceremonial recognition. He cast it as an instrument to make African traditionalists and spiritual practitioners bolder and more visible in public life. In remarks published by the presidency, Traorè described the day as an opportunity to draw from our fruitful ancestral sources and to vivify the values buried by decades of external pressure and internal stigmatization. Traorè and his ministers have been explicit about the political logic behind that cultural push. Restoring traditional spirituality's public presence, they say, will rewrite an old script that painted indigenous African rites as backward or even malign. That narrative, rooted in missionary-era descriptions and later colonial scholarship that routinely labeled non-Christian and non-Muslim practices as pagan, witchcraft, or worse, helped marginalize customary custodians, rituals, and knowledge systems across the continent. Voices inside Burkina Faso's cultural sector are arguing the new holiday is an attempt to reverse that long history of delegitimization. Traorè's interventions also leaned on history. His office and allied commentators stressed that the spiritual patterns and belief systems the holiday celebrates are not recent curiosities but social systems that precede the arrival of Islam and Christianity in many parts of the continent. Historians and encyclopedic sources likewise note that the numerous indigenous religious systems of Africa, with their cosmologies, ancestor practices, and ritual specialists, existed and functioned as central order-making institutions prior to those world religions spread. Framing the celebration this way places the state's action within a longer historical continuity, not as a nostalgic reinvention. Officials inside the transition government make no secret that cultural revival is integral to a broader push for African sovereignty and self-reliance. Analysts who track Traorè's agenda say the holidays, museum programs, and state support for traditional authorities are contiguous with economic and diplomatic moves, from renegotiating resource deals to tightening cultural policy, that aim to blunt external influence and remap national identity on indigenous terms. To supporters, restoring visibility and legal respect for traditional custodians is part of reclaiming epistemic authority. Who gets to say what counts as modern, legitimate, or national? Practically, the holiday's enactment has already produced on-the-ground measures. State communications have encouraged school visits to heritage sites, municipal events coordinated with chiefs and ritual leaders, and official messaging that places traditional festivals and ancestral rites alongside secular civic commemorations. Local journalists and Vox Pop reporting in Ouagadougou show a mixture of enthusiasm and skepticism, while many elder custodians welcome the visibility and symbolic restitution. Some urban youth and legal scholars asked how symbolic recognition will translate into structural protections, land rights for sacred sites, curricula changes, or formal status for customary jurisdictions. The ripple effects are already audible beyond Burkina Faso. Cultural organizations in the diaspora and neighboring capitals see Traorè's move as part of a wider decolonial moment, a set of policy choices and rhetorical frames that challenge the old Western-centric hierarchies of value. At the same time, observers warn of political instrumentalization, that cultural revival can be used to consolidate power, marginalize dissent, or blur lines between state authority and traditional hierarchies. The debate over whether public recognition will mean genuine restitution of authority or simply a patriotic stage prop is intensifying. As the May 15th observances spread into municipal programs, school calendars, and diplomatic messaging, the questions now moving to the fore are concrete. Will curriculum reforms teach indigenous epistemologies side by side with global histories? Will legal codes be adjusted to protect sacred sites and customary courts? And how will these cultural moves interact with Traorè's wider political project of economic reconfiguration and regional alliances? The answers are unfolding as communities test how far official recognition will go in restoring the practices and protections that earlier generations lost. I speak to anyone who carries a question in their chest, a name without a place, a story with a missing chapter, a longing for a lineage whose edges were frayed by the winds of history. This address is for those who feel, even faintly, the pull of an unnamed shore and who wonder what it would mean to remember more fully. Let us begin with a simple truth. The continent we call Africa is not merely a place on a map. It is a long, layered archive of knowledge, a living library of techniques, languages, rituals, songs, and ways of seeing the world that were developed over millennia. Across kingdoms and regions, people devised irrigation and agricultural systems, fashioned instruments and instruments of thought, carved out legal orders and moral grammars. The visible markers of that inheritance are enormous. Consider, for instance, the monuments and tomb complexes that still stand on the Nile and the shores of its valley, feats of engineering and organization that required sustained imagination, mathematical knowledge, and human coordination. These structures are testimony to the advanced civic, architectural, and spiritual life of ancient African societies. Alongside those monuments stood, and still stand, systems of belief and practice that made society intelligible and durable. Indigenous spiritual systems across the continent were not mere superstition. They were frameworks for remembering, for negotiating the seen and unseen worlds, and for organizing community life. They explained seasons and soils, ensured social reciprocity, settled disputes through customary law, and instructed other forms of knowledge such as herbal medicine and ecological stewardship. Many of these systems existed, adapted, and flourished long before the arrival in different regions of the major world religions that later became dominant. To say this is to insist on historical continuity, not to reject later traditions, but to acknowledge the deep roots that undergird the continent's living cultures. When we speak of revival, we must be clear about what that word is meant to do. Revival is not a march backwards into some imagined golden past. It is a deliberate retrieval, an act of excavation of practical knowledge and ethical habits that were productive and generative. It is the readoption of certain communal practices that once regulated land use, trust networks, craft know-how, and rites of passage, and which can be adapted to address our present needs. If a people remember how to care for their soils, how to manage water, how to craft durable structures, how to teach the next generation through apprenticeship and ritual, that is not nostalgia. It is a resource for resilience. We must also remember how memory was broken. For centuries, external narratives, from missionary tracts to colonial ethnographies, often depicted African spiritual systems as backward, pagan, or dangerous. Those narratives were not neutral descriptions. They were instruments of power, used to justify dispossession, extraction, and the erasure of indigenous authority. The result is a long cultural amnesia that is visible in school curricula, in legal codes that elevate imported norms over customary practice, and in popular imaginaries that distance young people from the knowledge of their grandparents. Recognizing this history of delegitimization is not an exercise in grievance alone. It is a preliminary step toward restoring a fuller, more honest picture of African experience. Recent scholarly and journalistic work has traced how contemporary leaders and movements are navigating this terrain of cultural reclamation and political repositioning. For people whose family trees were violently uprooted and carried far from their birthplace, for those scattered across oceans and continents, the question of memory acquires a particular urgency. The transatlantic slave trade and other displacements severed ties of language, ritual, and communal law. Names were replaced, languages fragmented, and the delicate scaffolding of social life was torn down. Yet, culture persists. Even in the most brutal conditions, stories, rhythms, and sacred practices survived in altered form, transformed not into nothing, but into new Creole logics. The Vodou of the Caribbean, the syncretic survivals of West Africa in the Americas, the songs and names that persisted in whispered forms and in altered ritual. Those survivals tell us something essential. Human communities do not vanish. They recast meaning under pressure. So what does reconnection look like when it is not a political demand but a cultural and spiritual journey? First, it begins with curiosity and humility. Curiosity to learn about languages, agricultural methods, healing practices, and oral histories. Humility to accept that history is complex and that the neat categories we carry in our heads, ancient and modern, traditional and technological, often obscure hybrid realities. Those who study the pyramids now understand them within long timelines of engineering achievement and human labor. Appreciating that complexity changes our relationship to the past and the possibilities of the present. Second, reconnection honors tradable, portable practices. Ritual, craft, song, and apprenticeship. Rituals are not merely liturgy. They are mnemonic devices, ways a people remember seasons, kinship rules, moral obligations, and ecological calendars. Crafts, pottery, ironworking, weaving, and code material science. Apprenticeship transmits embodied skills that classroom learning alone cannot replace. Imagine diaspora communities creating exchange networks for apprenticeships, celebrating shared rights in local communities abroad, supporting artisans whose techniques embody centuries of experimental knowledge. These practices revive practical capabilities and restore dignity to ways of life that markets often marginalize. Third, reconnection is relational rather than possessive. It recognizes that ancestral knowledge belongs to communities and custodians. It requires listening to elders and traditional custodians, compensating keepers of oral history, and protecting sacred sites. Where possible, partnerships between scholars, cultural institutions, and custodial communities can help recover endangered languages, revive festivals, and map ecological knowledge that could inform climate adaptation. Institutional recognition in schools, museums, and policy can be part of this process, but only if it is respectful and led by the holders of the knowledge themselves. There are spiritual dimensions here that cannot be reduced to policy alone. Across many African cosmologies, ancestors are not absent dead. They are active presences who shape ethical life and collective memory. Rituals of libation, naming ceremonies, and public remembrances are practices that reaffirm relationships between the living and the lineages that produced them. For people who have felt the amputations of history, such practices can be a kind of embodied therapy, an enacted continuity that resists the erasure of forced exile. Framed this way, cultural revival is also an act of healing. We must also acknowledge the political and institutional questions that come with revival. Recognition without protection can be hollow. Legal frameworks that secure sacred sites, land use rights that respect customary tenure, curricula reforms that include indigenous knowledge, and archival work that digitizes endangered oral histories. These are the building blocks of structural support. Several communities and states have already experimented with curated days of remembrance, cultural festivals, and heritage programs designed to restore visibility to indigenous practices. Those initiatives offer models and lessons for others. Let us imagine, for a moment, what a reawakened cultural ecology might produce. Picture urban neighborhoods where traditional herbalists collaborate with community health centers, where young architects study ancestral building techniques that offer passive cooling and climate resilience, where school lessons include local myths, proverbs, and ecological calendars alongside global history, where diaspora artists and craftspeople maintain networks that keep endangered idioms alive. None of this eliminates modernity. Rather, it enriches and pluralizes it, adding resilient techniques and ethical repertoires that might otherwise have been lost. What does this work ask of us, individually and collectively? It asks for patience and generosity. It asks those of us in the diaspora to learn without claiming, to approach teachers, not to take without permission, and to be accountable to the communities who have stewarded these practices. It asks cultural institutions to disentangle colonial frames and to create platforms where custodians, not curators alone, lead the telling of their own stories. It asks young people to see ancestral knowledge not as an impediment but as a source of design, problem-solving, and identity. Finally, the call here is not simply to look backward, but to reweave the past into the present in ways that produce new futures. The knowledge systems of our ancestors, their engineering, their ecological wisdom, their social ethics are materials. They are not museum pieces to be admired from a distance. They can be laboratories from which we draw solutions for housing, agriculture, climate resilience, and social cohesion today. Tonight, then, is an invitation, not a command. It is an invitation to explore, to listen, to learn, and to act with humility. For those separated by oceans and history, reconnection may take many forms. A song learned from a grandmother, a tree planted in a memory garden, a festival revived in a new city, an apprentice who learns a craft that had nearly vanished. These acts are small in isolation but cumulative in effect. Over time, they stitch together damaged webs. If we take this path carefully, respectfully, and with the agency of custodial communities at the center, we do not merely recover isolated facts about the past. We restore a sense of continuity, a moral grammar anchored in forms older than the narratives that once sought to erase them. In that restoration there is a kind of blessing, not mystical magic, but the practical return of capacities, languages, and relationships that strengthen human life. And in those recovered capacities, we might find new energies with which to face our shared present.